Yes, well, I think we can kick off at 7 o'clock. Welcome everybody to the Fabian Auckland team that have put together a session that, of course, comes immediately out of the experience we've had of the floods and the devastation of climate change and its impact on Auckland City, and then the debate that followed from that. So I welcome everybody to this event, Kia ora whānau. And it gives me great pleasure to have Matthew and Julie here. It's a direct result of those events that we've had, that we now are seriously considering the way in which a city can survive climate change, can survive the impact of various things that the flood that the climates will throw at us, which of course is not just from the sky, but it's also when the water levels rise and the stuff comes down the creek, and you've got the slash, and you've got the pollution, and you've got the silt and everything that just lingers on afterwards. So it gives me great pleasure to have Matthew and Julie here. Julie, from her experience with the council, and she wrote an article quite quickly after the episode on the spongy city for Auckland, which was published in the Herald, and it was certainly worth visiting again and elaborating on. And Matthew also wrote in the Herald quite quickly, and I think on Newsroom, was it Matthew? With a paper that was certainly worth another look. And it's with some pleasure that I asked Matthew if you'd like to start with your presentation and talk to us about how we do build resilient cities.
How can I get more sound, please? It's very quiet.
I don't know what I can do here for that. Maybe it's...
Can you turn your mic up?
Well, I'll give it a go. Where am I in my mic?
Right.
Is that you speaking, Matthew?
No, not yet.
No, okay. Sorry, no, I can't see what I could do to improve. Is it true for everybody that the sound's bad?
No.
How's that? Can anyone hear me? Is that okay?
Yes,
I can hear everything.
I can hear everybody. Yes.
I can hear it fine. So
Okay.
Matthew, can I just ask you to carry on? Thanks.
Yeah, sure.
Matthew, your sound needs to be turned up on your device.
Okay, I don't want to deafen everyone. How's that? Is that better? I've turned it up. Is that
You're
better?
fine. You sound fine.
Okay, cool.
Oh,
Okay.
that's better too.
Okay, excellent. Great solution. So kia ora, and thanks very much for inviting me, Phil, and the Fabian Society. Great honor. I'm going to put that on top of my PBREF list. Obviously, Fabian, very distinguished history, and so I feel honored but also kind of humbled at the distinguished company. So great, thanks again. So I teach at Unitec and teach in the landscape architecture program, and I've written a book called Water City a couple of years ago, which is really about these kinds of issues, about climate change and flooding and the kind of consequences for how we might design our city. And I've also did an interview with the saintly Catherine Ryan, so if people are interested, they can hear me talk a little bit more about this kind of stuff on RNZ. So hopefully this doesn't turn into a lecture. I thought what I'd just do is just kind of talk a little bit about the flood and I guess how we kind of what the consequences have been for us in Auckland. Then talk a little bit about, well, what can we do about it? What are some kind of actions we can do? Then talk a little bit about some overseas examples of especially in Copenhagen, of what they did when they had a flood, and then sort of wrap it up with some kind of a conclusion about maybe future direction. So that's sort of the trajectory of my 10 minutes. Hopefully don't go over that. Yeah, so I guess I live in town, so to kind of start talking about the neighborhood, which is Grey Lynn, and Grey Lynn obviously flooded very badly, and which was kind of terrible, but kind of fine because it stayed in the park. But unfortunately, it obviously didn't stay in the park, and it kind of all tipped out the northern end into Dryden Street, and then we had this terrible flooding in Dryden Street, and especially at the intersection of Dryden Street and Coburn Street, and that's where these houses were really, really badly flooded, and people, were essentially in danger of their lives. So that was a really, really kind of bad kind of situation. But perhaps it shouldn't have been a surprise. I guess by now everyone in Auckland knows all about geomaps, and we just need to kind of look at this council website. We need to look at our kind of city and switch those maps on, and we can see exactly where the flooding was going to go, and this intersection of Coburn Street, Hakanoa, Coburn, Dryden Street, where it flooded. Well, that's where it was indicated to flood. And so, why did it flood there? Because obviously we're part of this bigger kind of thing in Grey Lynn. Well, wherever we live, we're part of this bigger kind of picture, and that's called a catchment. So when we look at Grey Lynn, when we look at Grey Lynn Park, when we look way down in the corner of Hakanoa Street, we're actually part of this huge kind of catchment. Ponsonby Road, Great North Road, Old Mill Road, and that's all contributing to that flooding. So I think one of the consequences of the flood has been that I think everybody is really conscious of where we are where we live, where we're placed inside that catchment, and where water is going, where flooding's going. I mean, we've almost we call these models, and people like Healthy Waters build these kind of models to show where flood is going to happen, where overland flow paths is going to happen. Well, we were on the 27th of January, we were kind of in a real life model. We are all really kind of conscious of where overland flow paths are and where flooding is, and we don't need a map. It actually happened. And so why did it happen there? Because we, very essentially, we covered up the kind of original topography of our city. So, if we look at maps of Tamaki, especially kind of Maori place names, if you look at place names in Tamaki, I think there's something like 60 place names that would begin with Y. So that's probably a bit of a clue. And there is this kind of amazing system of streams and wetlands all over the isthmus, this fantastic kind of network which we've done our best to kind of cover up and to put into pipes. And really the consequence of that flood has really been the revenge, or the streams and those wetlands have really come back. And this is a famous map, the Hochstetter map, which we normally look at volcanoes. But I was just looking at it the other day and just looking at all these bits between the lava flows, and actually realizing these are all wetlands. So Grey Lynn Park is, I don't know if you can see my little arrow, Grey Lynn Park's actually where that sort of bit of drawing that Hochstetter did. So you think of Sandringham, which all flooded. Sandringham's actually between these two lava flows from Mangawhau. So this kind of Maori place names, the Maori map of Auckland, the Hochstetter map of Auckland is really a really kind of accurate predictor of kind of where those floods are going to, where they happened and where they're going to happen. Even this 19th century plan of Grey Lynn, you can see Grey Lynn Park in the centre, and there's this kind of little line going through it, which is obviously the stream before it was stuck into a pipe. So the 19th century and 20th century are obviously a story of Europeans building over this landscape. This is Cox's Creek, filling it, building a causeway across the mouth of it, and then filling it up. Forming a kind of park, and then obviously building over this landscape. So that's the kind of, I guess that's the kind of story of Auckland, is a kind of original Indigenous landscape which was built over and changed, and we thought, well, that's all gone. but it's kind of come back. So I guess what can we do? What are some kind of practical ways that we can address those problems and start to kind of build resilience? Because we all know there's going to be another flood, and that the next flood's probably going to be worse. So I think we're already kind of quite a way into this sort of this consciousness raising. It's amazing. I'm being stopped in the street by all sorts of people, and the most unlikely people are explaining to me very in a lot of detail exactly how important parks are and how important catchments are and how important overland flow paths are. So I think in Auckland that language, that kind of understanding of hydrology is really I think kind of everyone gets it. Well, a lot of people do get it. So that's good that we that people do have that consciousness. So what can we do with it? And so again, it's about understanding that we live in this kind of complex ecological system. We all live in a catchment. Doesn't matter where you are in Auckland. Doesn't matter what sort of house you've got. You're part of a catchment. You can be, top of the catchment, bottom of the catchment. But what's happening in that catchment is going to affect you. And so, what your neighbour does, what someone down a few houses down the road does, what someone does upstream from you, that's really a big effect. So I think there's two kind of consequences for that. I think what it means is, and I get asked this quite a few times, what can I do? How, as an individual, what can I do with my house or my garden, or how can I kind of prevent flooding? It's a little bit like, well, not that much, but as a collective, we definitely can do. So I think this is a real kind of call for local action and community action. And, as a community, we can kind of do things about what happens in the catchment. So, somebody building a wall and blocking off a kind of overland flow path, that's not a good idea. Or somebody building, a big building at the top of a catchment, which is, building what we call impervious surface, which means we have less surface to kind of suck up water. That's not a good thing. So I guess the short thing is being conscious that we're in a catchment, being able to understand what's happening in the catchment, being able to understand that there is water being collected and then it goes in various directions, and that our actions in that catchment actually have real consequences for how that water flows in the catchment. And one of the big things is impervious, what we call this impervious surface. So the more we build in a catchment, the more we build, on the surface, the more we build impervious surfaces, that's, concrete and roofs and houses and so forth, the more we have runoff, and then consequently, the more we have flooding, the more water kind of builds up. So, I think we really need to be conscious. So I think the flood of, the great flood we had, this consciousness that we live in catchments is something that, can really drive a kind of awareness of what's happening in our community, and that really drives a kind of understanding about future urban design, because obviously Auckland's growing. We're going to need more buildings, we're going to need more apartments, we're going to need more places, but where they get built and what their footprint is really critical for how that catchment's going to work in the next flood. And so I think so I think as a community, I guess what I'm saying is, as a community, we can see a catchment, we know what's going on in the catchment. Healthy Waters has models, computer models of catchments and how they're going to work. You can actually put a future development into a catchment and then run that model, and that you can actually understand the hydrological consequences of it. So I think that gives us real power over, or potentially it gives the community real power and make decisions about how the city could be developed. So yeah, I mean, I'm just being super quick, but so I guess when we're thinking about future urban development, what we're really looking for is development. So housing is important. I'm not saying don't do any housing, anything like that. Obviously, don't put houses in overland flow paths or in floodplains. Definitely, you can put housing into catchments, but I think we need to be conscious that when we do that, we're not covering up tons of ground, that we're actually leaving what we call permeable surface. We're leaving grass or parks or whatever. And I think a really great example, I mean, this is really old, but a really great example is in Freeman's Bay and the Freeman's Bay Park. And you've got these amazing star blocks, which were built in the 1950s. And, there's actually 16 apartments in there on, it was quite small footprint, and they're in a park. And, again, this area was flooded. This is a little bit of a sidebar, but this area got flooded in January 27th. But these, and you can sort of see where the overland flow path, where the flood kind of went through the development. But you can sort of see these buildings here. They're out of the flood because they've clustered. They've made the apartments. They've made little towers. They haven't built all over the site, and they've left the ability of flooding to kind of go through the site, through this green kind of corridor. So, I think we need to so when we're looking at our catchment, when we're looking at our community, we need to be starting to think about, we need more green space. We need more areas to absorb water. And when we're making decisions about housing, we need to be thinking about, well, what sort of housing is it? And, potentially we need to be going up and a smaller kind of footprint. Phil, how am I going for time?
You're okay. We're
okay. All right.
Another 5 minutes.
5 minutes, brilliant. Yeah, okay, so that's great. So I think these are concrete things we can all do as individuals, and we can all do as part of communities, and part of a local body, and we can all kind of get together, and these are kind of, we can sort of see what's going on in a catchment, and we can understand the consequences of what's happening in a catchment. What's the big picture? What can we do in terms of the big picture? Well, I think, we can think of other cities that have had a similar kind of situation to us. So 2012, Copenhagen had a very bad flood, although, when you read about it, they got, I think, 130 mils, somewhere like that. We got 300. But having said that, obviously Copenhagen's a lot more dense city than ours. There's practically no open space. So they had, it was very bad flooding and huge amount of money in damages, insurance claims, and so forth. So what they did was they came up with this kind of strategy to, how can we build resilience to future flooding? So it's a very complex plan. It's called the cloud-based plan. There's lots of engineering in it. But I think the thing that kind of interests me is actually looking at the urban design and looking at the landscape consequences of flooding. And so what they said was, actually, we have parks in the city, and we could use those parks to actually detain floodwater, and we have streets, and we could use those streets to convey flood water to the harbour. So detention and conveyance are kind of the two kind of things which we look for in flooding. And so, but obviously with streets, you can't kind of have, because streets are obviously cambered this way. You kind of need to alter them. And so what they did was develop a kind of strategy of detaining the water in existing parks by redesigning those parks, and then redesigning certain streets so that they could convey the water to the harbour. And 99% of the time, no flood. So these streets have lovely park centres, and then when it floods, that centre of the street becomes an overland flow path. And similarly with parks, the parks are kind of redesigned, so they have these new functions in them, like basketball courts, hockey courts, with like an amphitheatre. And then when it floods, those parks then fill up with water. So we've got these kind of we're using the kind of social space that we have, but redesigning it in a way to allow for flooding and to detain floodwater. Okay, last stretch. So what's that got to do with us, and how can we use this information? Well, again, I guess what I'm saying is, all the information's there. We know about flooding. We know where it's going to flood. We know about catchments. We know about models, and we have techniques, and we have people who are kind of doing all this stuff already, and they're called landscape architects. And so, for example, in the upper Oakley Creek, a new scheme a couple of years old now by Boffa Miskell, to redesign the creek to make it in a more natural kind of pattern, and to put in play infrastructure and planting, and also to help absorb flooding. Daldy Street, which I'm sure you've all walked down in Wynyard Quarter, designed by Land Lab, is actually a flood conveyance path. It's been specially designed. All the levels and the cambers on Daldy Street have been designed to convey any flooding towards the sea. And it's quite interesting in the flood, the guy who designed it, Henry Crothers, actually drove down there, and there wasn't any flooding in Daldy Street. So that's obviously kind of working. Our students at Unitec are kind of working on these issues. This is Sandring, which we know flooded really badly, and so this is a kind of a project where the students just looked at an overland flow path that's come down from Mount Roskill Road to Sandringham Shops, and then just gone, well, actually it flows between some local parks, and then there's some Housing New Zealand areas, and he's actually kind of constructed a little kind of green corridor through the suburb that's going to absorb the water, detain the water, convey the water. So there's a whole lot of strategy, so all these strategies we all know about, and we can all use them. And this is a project I did as my own practice in Albany. So this is a rain garden, so it's taking water from Albany and soaking it up. Swales, again, catching water before that disappears into the stream, and daylighting an existing stream. So, all these, I guess, all the techniques we're talking about to build resilience to flooding, we're already doing it. I guess we already have the expertise. We already have the kind of knowledge of kind of how to do that. So what's the conclusion? The conclusion is read the why. So I was talking to a friend of mine, Phil Wihongi, one of our students, is now working with Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei, and so we were talking about the flooding and what we could do about it. And he was really saying, look, there's this fantastic network of existing streams of awa. There's a great network of where wetlands were and really to build resilience to that is just really rediscovering where all those existing streams and wetlands are and freeing them. Thanks very much. Ngā mihi nui.
Thank you very much, Matthew. There are some questions or comments already appearing in the chat. I'm not sure if you've spotted them, Matthew. Well, maybe it's easier when we're back. Yeah, there we go. We've got there's a comment there from where is it? Here we go, from Deborah in Christchurch. She's made the observation that her house is at the back section and she's got a long asphalt driveway. Is she now responsible for making that a permeable membrane of some sort?
A permeable surface, yeah. I think, to be honest, I'm not quite sure what GIS they have in Christchurch, but yeah, if they have a GIS in Christchurch with flooding and overland flow paths, I suggest she turns that layer on and has a look where her house is and what's happening. And
Jeff Foley's asking the question about the fact that it's interesting to know all of this, and it seems like we might have known it for quite a long time, that common sense was driving us towards this. So the inertia to ignore it all, has it come from council, or has it come from communities, or has it just come from short-term economic thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, there's, lots of reasons, but yeah, I mean, I think one of the big problems with Auckland is, there's no good land left. And so definitely, I think pretty much all the good land pretty much had been built on, even by the Second World War. And so you'll often see a lot of housing projects being built post-war, and they're being built in floodplains because that was sort of the only land that was really left, and everyone thought, well, she'll be right. We'll stick some pipes in, and it'll be fine. Yeah.
And there's also a question from Timo, but I think what I'd like to do now is ask Julie to speak, because Julie, you also raised questions and pointed out the merits of a council that would be responsive to making a spongy city. So without further ado, would you like to talk to the meeting? Julie. You're on mute still, Julie. Julie, you're on mute.
Muted.
Sorry, I was trying to share my screen and I can apparently only do one thing at a time. So I don't know, Phil, if you can share my screen for me.
I think, are you with this, Brian? Can you uplift it? I don't have a copy of your PowerPoint.
No, you don't. That's okay. All right. I will just speak to it as if you can see it. How's that go?
That'll be good.
Yeah,
Sorry,
sure.
Julie.
That's okay. What I might try and do in the background is send it to you at the same time, and then if it works, it works.
Thank
And if
you.
it doesn't, it doesn't.
Thank you.
That's okay. So kia ora koutou, ko Julie Fairey te kuinga.
Could I suggest, Julie, that you turn your video on and then you click at the bottom where it says share screen. So you've got to have it on first before you start trying to share it.
Right. Well, my video is on. Can you see it now?
We can.
Yes.
We can. We can. Wet.
All right.
Julie.
Yeah. I've had some terrible experiences trying to share from Google Slides, but today seems to not be one of those. So that's good. Thank you for your patience. Yeah.
Thank you, Robert.
So, right. So first of all, I am a councillor. I represent the ward of Albert Eden Puketepapa, and I was first elected in October last year. So quite new to being on the governing body, around the table with the mayor and 20 colleagues from around the region. But prior to that, I did spend 12 years on the Puketepapa local board. So I have got some experience and knowledge about council, more from the local perspective, and now getting my head around the regional. And Phil mentioned an article I wrote, which was actually for the floods last year, in March last year, which I'll put a link to in the comments later, which was about thinking about some of the infrastructure we've already built, some of the examples Matthew was using, where actually we've deliberately made it so that a park floods or a road floods, so that a house or a business doesn't flood. What happened on the 27th was that a lot of that soft infrastructure wasn't sufficient, and certainly the hard infrastructure, so the pipes and what's under the ground wasn't either. So that's some of the challenge that Auckland now faces. And someone mentioned before the issue about who's to blame, and I'll come back to that one because it's at least partly council's fault. So I just like to often start with this cartoon because a lot of the discussions I end up having in this space, people are like, well, why don't we just do, build more pipes, or why don't we just make sure everybody has a rain garden on their roof or whatever. There aren't simple answers to this. They are complex. And Matthew's talked really eloquently about the technical side of that, which is not to say that we as citizens can't understand this and have a say in it. We absolutely can, but it's to acknowledge that there are many solutions and we need to tap many of those techniques, not just go, okay, there's one answer to this problem. There definitely isn't. And when we talk about sponges, which I'll come to, we're talking about a combination of big sponges like your Cox's Bay Park, and lots of little sponges. So that's where the question that was being asked before about the driveway. Well, what if we lay, previously that driveway, I think you mentioned, had been fine stone. That would be more permeable. What if we used goby bricks? What if we acknowledge that not everybody needs a full driveway to their garage, because most people don't park their car in their garage anymore? So actually, do you need to have a concrete pathway like at my house, which goes all the way to the garage? We do, because that's where we charge our car. So, but in other circumstances, that may no longer be a requirement. So there's lots of complicated little answers, and some of them big. Yeah. So a little bit, Matthew also mentioned, which was fantastic, and he did it far better than I could. I had this slide in to remind me to say it, that Tangata Whenua knew all of this before Pākehā came, and actually a lot of what we're doing is rediscovering knowledge that they already had, and really acknowledging the mātauranga that Māori are able to bring, and particularly where it's their whenua, but also broader techniques and understanding of how we free the wai. So thank you, Matthew, for covering that. So a little bit about the Auckland context. This is quite an old map from Census 2013, but largely still applies. And I put these two side by side to illustrate one of the challenges that we deal with, that flows onto transport and housing, which in turn has a real impact on land use, which then has real implications for stormwater and flooding and climate resilience. So you can clearly see there, it's a big region. In fact, neither of these maps cover the whole region, because there are parts of Franklin and Rodney that don't fit in this picture. We also have islands in the Gulf that don't fit in these pictures. And we also have the challenge of the fact that we don't necessarily have alignment between where people live and where they work or where the centres of education are. And so that creates transport issues, as well as a mismatch between our housing and where people actually need to live their lives. So the political context, and this is something I drew to try and explain a little bit last year, prior to the election. So the mayor is elected by everybody. Then there are 20 ward councillors from around the region. And then within that, there are local boards, 21 local boards, and there is a split in what we are responsible for. And so some of the stormwater stuff sits at the local level, and some of it sits at the regional level. Most of the money is regional, and that becomes quite important, because if you want to do a local project, the money to do it is actually going to be regional money, and I'll get to that. So that's just to give you an idea of what the split is in terms of where things sit for decision making. And you'll see there, obviously down the bottom, CCOs, transport sits with Auckland Transport, and Watercare deals with 2 of the 3 waters. So they deal with wastewater and drinking water, and then stormwater is over here with Auckland Council, but may in the future be together under 3 waters. So the reason I mentioned transport a bit is because the largest source of runoff is actually our roading network. And it's also some of the most extensive of our stormwater infrastructure. Curb and channel, the gully traps and grates that you see on the road, that's stormwater infrastructure. And most people don't even see it in their everyday lives. So I just wanted to point that out. That sits with Auckland Transport, and sometimes it can be quite problematic, because above ground, it's with AT, below ground, it's with the stormwater team. And that's created some of the mismatch that led to some of the flooding on the 27th, with catch pits not being cleared and stuff like that. So very briefly, 3 ideas that are really central for me to the way I think about local government, and which inform a lot of my views in this space. Donut economics, which is really well explained in the diagram, so I won't go into that too much. but the idea of creating space for us as a society, as human beings, in between the natural limits of the planet and the basic needs of human beings, socially, economically, all of that, culturally, spiritually, all of that stuff. Also, the 15-minute city is a really important concept to me, and one that we need to create, I think, over and over again in Auckland, and will potentially also have a bearing on some of the climate resilience and stormwater issues. And you'll see that the picture on the left there has a stream, a river running through the middle of it, which is a pretty good start for managing your stormwater. And also the 5 ways to wellbeing, and this is a tool from the Mental Health Foundation that has been proven time and again to help individual mental health, but also to be a really useful framework to think about community investment that organisations like Council make, and how we create space, both physical and virtual, for people to be able to meet these 5 ways to wellbeing in their everyday life. So those 3 things are really key to the way that I think in this space. So parks are, and Matthew mentioned before, the 2 key things in managing this stuff: detention and conveyance. And parks have a really key role in meeting potentially both of those needs. But also, parks have a whole lot of other functions. And this is part of the complicating factor, is that for a long time, a lot of us in Auckland have only looked at parks as a sports field, as a place for a playground, as having ecological functions, where we grow bush, that kind of stuff. But actually, a lot of our parks, and the one in the bottom, what is that left there, the misty one, that's Keithhay Park, which is not far from my house, actually designed to flood. And so, I had a lot of messages on the 28th of January saying, hey, Keithhay Park's turned into a lake, as if that were a problem. And actually, that's great, because all the water that was in the Keithhay Park lake was not in people's homes. So we've kind of lost that understanding, and there's that need to sort of re-educate people that in some cases it is supposed to flood so that your house doesn't. And that's one of the things with a lot of our parks. They have a role for detention and also potentially for conveyance, depending on where they are. And Keithhay Park is in between 2 tributaries to Te Oakley Creek. So it also has a role in potentially in conveyance to those to that creek, which runs out to the harbour. This is a map of a whole lot of the different open spaces that are in the Puketepapa area where I'm most familiar with, and just gives you a sense of, actually, there might be more open space there than you thought, and that's some of that, not all of it, is by design. In some cases, these are parcels of land that were the least economic to build on, as opposed to the best place to put a park or have a stormwater reserve or whatever. But in some cases, there has been work done to identify where would be the best place to do a park, to help us to manage stormwater, to make sure people can access sports fields within a short distance, all of those things. And that's where we get to the Te Aonga project, which I was very involved with. Matthew mentioned before, and had quite a much nicer map than this one, which I hand drew because we couldn't get council to produce any nice maps. So it's good that there are nice maps now, but I do quite like my version. So that was a project where previously it had been mostly grass, a few trees, and a concrete channel through the middle of these 2 parks. This in the Wesley community, which is primarily a Decile 1 area under the old system, lots of state housing and renters and private rentals and low income, and they had a lot of flooding issues. They still do have flooding issues. This area did flood on January 27th, but I am pretty sure that it flooded a lot less than it would have before that soft infrastructure was put in. It definitely slowed down the water, and that's a significant benefit. So we didn't get, in that area, we got the water sort of slowly rising, as opposed to in some other areas where we would get gushes and, you know, like rapids and stuff like that, which was very destructive. And that didn't happen in this area. Yeah, and Kāinga Ora are looking to redevelop this area, actively working on that at the moment, and there's an opportunity there to make it more resilient and to potentially have more open space put in detention tanks that weren't done back when they originally built a lot of that housing. So
before you go on, it says underwater park or Underwood Park. What does that mean?
So there's two parks. So Underwood is the one on the western side, and Walmsley Park is the one on the eastern side. Underwood's just the name of the park.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I mentioned before the stuff around transport and the fact that the roading network is a really big part of our stormwater infrastructure. And that's one of the reasons why I put this slide up, is because a big part of the work in the climate space is getting people to shift modes away from ones that use fossil fuels and into more mass transit so that we can move people more efficiently. But also part of it is making sure that the transport corridors we do build have that water resilience in them, so that we're putting rain gardens along the side, which might mean sacrificing some car parking. That, you know, and you can see there with the, for people who are familiar with the stations on the Northern Expressway, which is the photo on the bottom left, a lot of those actually have plantings around them. And that is part of offsetting all of that impervious surface, all that concrete, and giving water a place to soak into. Most of the areas that I've been dealing with bad flooding issues on the isthmus, they might look like they have some stormwater infrastructure in the roading network, but in actual fact, most of those gully traps are not connected to any pipes. So it's what is referred to in Healthy Waters terminology as soakage, which means they're putting it down into the ground to soak, but it's actually not connected to any pipes that are going anywhere. In some cases where there is a pipe, the pipe delivers it to somewhere that is designed to be a better place to soak it up, like a school field. And in some cases, it's even connected with the wastewater network, which is a recipe for disaster, and some of the reason why we had so much poo in the water on the 27th. The central interceptor will help a little bit with those ones, but it's mainly about the wastewater. So then we get to land use, which has a really close relationship, obviously, with transport. People need to move based on where they need to go in relation to where they live, right? So this is a map that just shows some of the zoning, the complicated stuff around zoning. But actually, if you look out at this, all of the orange and yellow stuff is residential. All of the purple stuff and pink stuff is business. So it's actually not as complicated as it at first appears. The gradations from dark orange, which is you can build to, in general, through these areas about 6 stories, through to the very light looks white, which is single housing zone. This is all about to change because of Plan Change 78 and the National Policy Statement on Urban Development. But it's really important to note that a lot of the housing we have now is at that detached single family homes end. We're getting more that's being built in that missing middle there of medium density housing, and we are getting more apartments. But a lot of those detached single family homes don't necessarily suit people through their whole life cycle, right? So there'll be times in your life where an apartment might work. There's times in your life where a 1-bedroom place would be great. There's times in your life where you might need 3 or 4 bedrooms and a backyard. But what we've largely done is built those detached single family homes, and people have made their lives work to that housing, which then has implications for land use, for transport, and for how we have those little sponges on that residential land. So the more inefficient we are with our housing, then the less soakage space we have. Particularly when we're building, as Matthew talked very well to before, in floodplains and overland flood paths. Now, no one is advocating that we do what's on the right here, that we just build 100 apartments in the corner and leave everything else. But there is a happy medium to be found here, right? And when we're talking about making sure that we have enough space for water to soak into, I find this quite a useful graphic, because the other thing we know is, and I just need to check my notes here about where I'm up to. Yes, the other thing that we need to note here is that trees soak up a lot more water than lawn. And lawn doesn't soak up as much water if it's had heavy vehicles parked on it and it's compacted the dirt as well. So going back to that one, you've got lots of trees there as well, whereas on the other one, yes, you've got your 100 houses, but there's not a lot of trees, and trees can soak up a lot more water when it's falling from the sky, right? So that's all part of the thinking, and I always like to try and put in a shout out for trees because I think they're amazing and we need more of them. So we also need to think about a range of other infrastructure and making sure that it's built in a way that's resilient. One of the things that happened, particularly in the cyclone, was that a lot of power lines came down. And because of the flooding, we couldn't get the trucks there and the workers there safely to fix the lines. So is putting lines above ground, where potentially they're more vulnerable to the weather, always the best idea? Perhaps not, and maybe we need to look at undergrounding them, as we have done with the gas lines. And we need to think about the climate resilience and the impact of flooding on things like our technological infrastructure, you know, how people now communicate and keep in touch. And that bottom photo on the right is another photo from Te Aonga that shows how high above the stream the pathway is. And the calculations at the time, I think, were that that should be okay in something like a 1 in 50 year. But the advice from Healthy Waters now is that they're having to redo all of their modelling based on the idea that what we thought was 1 in 50 or 1 in 100 may well turn out to be more like 1 in 10. Those figures are not their figures. I'm just using that by way of illustration, that the models we've relied on, in a lot of cases, we've built bridges and parks, for example, to a 1 in 100 year tolerance. 1 in 100 may now be 1 in 20. In which case, do we change our tolerance? Do we build differently? Do we build in different places? These are, you know, as I say, not a simple answer, but you know, something we definitely need to grapple with. And that's another thing about the climate aspect as well, is the temperature too, and what more water, sitting water, might mean with higher temperature in terms of you know, mosquitoes, some of the illnesses that we might find come to New Zealand that we haven't had to deal with in the past, and then the role that trees again can play in helping us to moderate that. And finally, I often finish with this slide, so sorry if you've seen it before, but you know, people used to, hopefully no one on this call and no one, it's becoming less common that people are talking about climate change not being a real thing. And, you know, what we've seen in the last 2 months is climate change. What we saw with 2 years of drought 2 years ago was also climate change. So hopefully nobody is still in denial. But even if it is a hoax, look at all these great things that we would need to do anyway. So that's me. Kia ora.
Thank you so much, Julie. Well, those are 2 great presentations, people. And I just can I draw your attention to the button on the bottom of the screen where you've got reactions. And if you want to ask a question, click on the hands up button down there, and I'll be able to notice that you've got your hand up and you've got a question. Are there questions immediately coming from the floor? Adrian, what's your question, please? Adrian, you're muted at the moment. Adrian, while you sort your mute out, maybe Marianne, could I go to you? You've got a question.
Yes, please. It's both to Julie and, first of all, thank you very much. It was just what I needed, because you provided some answers. I think, Julie, I'm going to go into the political thing in the sense of working with community. I got the sensation from you, lovely Matthew, that's a lot of this work could be done at community level with a good city council. It seemed, I don't know how Auckland is organised. I've tried to ignore Auckland all my life, to be perfectly honest. But I know that here in Wellington there are, and I'm pretty sure I can see that in Dunedin too, that there are those small council groups, the boards, the community boards. And it seems that that might be a way of beginning. But
so.
we're going to have to learn the timing, because people apply to do building. And by the time they start building and we, the people, see that they're building, because I'd have to own up, I do not read all the applications for building. And I don't know, but we see the building happen. We want to know what are they doing to mitigate what's actually happening. How the hell do we get, as ordinary citizens, get ahead of the whole process of the pressure that goes, and it is pressure, to deliver consents? Either of you.
Julie, you first.
Sure. Kia ora, Marion, and it's an honour to have you on the call. Thank you for your work over the years. My experience with the Te Aonga project was that the community intimately understood the need for it.
Yeah.
Really it was about getting the council resources was the key thing. And what happened there was that was actually the first time that Auckland Council anyway, and we've only been around since 2010, but had actually worked across different departments on a project like that. So previously it would have primarily been delivered by the Healthy Waters, the Stormwater team, with probably working a bit with the Parks team, which we call Community Facilities, but who knows, they'll restructure next month and have a new name, I'm sure. So, but what happened was that basically someone who I knew, and I was chair of the local board at the time, came to me and said, look, a number of us through the organisation are keen to try some new approaches to these, what are basically stormwater projects. And we've identified this one that's in your area. Do you think your local board would be keen? I said, yes, definitely. And from there, it became, okay, how do we have community involvement? How do we work with the friends group that's already well established for that stream? What are the other amenity values we can get? Because those parks had no toilets, no playground, barely even had a walking path through them. So it became a much bigger project that we were able to get a whole lot of other benefits off for the community. And that meant, and that plus a lot of comms and slow working with people over time to come up with the plans, meant that we had the community buy-in, that it was just a no-brainer that it go ahead. And when the construction started, the construction partner, who I think was Fulton Hogan, they did a lot of effort to keep the locals informed, and because it's pretty hard to have that kind of construction two years in your back garden. And now the benefit has been really obvious. So how do we harness that example? And this is why I talk about it so often, and show that to other communities. And earlier in the year, last year actually, I had Phil Twyford bring some people over from Te Aratū with Shane Henderson, who are really interested in, okay, how do we do this there? And the key thing was that we managed to get the regional money. Right. And that was the thing that made it possible, because that was a $25 to $30 million project and they didn't have to buy any land.
Right.
So, we are talking big money. So it is, how do we move the politicians to acknowledge that this is urgent, and that, as Matthew said, we have all the tools, but we need to do the mahi and we need to involve the community in that mahi. So, we've just had an election, didn't go so well in Auckland. I doubt I have a majority at the table for this kind of investment. Next time around, I'm hoping for a better result. And in the meantime, it's about having those conversations, educating the community, building hope, and identifying the wins that I can get across the line where I can. And I have actually talked to the mayor about stormwater infrastructure, and he's actually quite interested in it, but he has other priorities too that will probably be higher up his list.
Thank you, Julie.
I hope that's helpful.
That is helpful. You may get a call from me
Yeah, great.
To be able to talk to this to a wider, to another group,
Yeah,
because I
sure.
think it's really important. But
Just-
thank you.
Yeah,
Yep.
so just a quick comment, Marion, and again, great work. Thanks for the question, Marion. So just talking to people in Grey Lynn, I mean, I they're talking about, okay, they're really realizing that they're in a catchment. They're realizing, that it flooded, and the reason was because of, all the stuff around them. Again, I think it's just all the information's there. All the people are working on these things. There's lots of little community groups. There's lots of people working on existing streams. We're working at Unitec. We're working in Mangere with the Te Ararata stream group, and so to a large extent, I think the project really is bringing all those groups together that are already working on these things, but they're in a disconnected way.
Right.
Bringing a community group, and I think the catchment's the key. Understanding that we're in the catchment, understanding that we're all working. We're all living in this catchment. There are all these community groups doing little bits in the catchment. Maybe there's a local body that's getting some money to kind of build something in a catchment.
Yeah.
You can actually start directing, if you start understanding what's happening in the catchment, where people are building stuff, you can actually start directing. I know money is disappearing because of situation, but you can actually start directing money into projects that are actually going to help in that catchment.
Right.
Maybe building a wetland in the corner of the park, maybe daylighting a kind of an existing stream, and actually having a kind of program that sort of goes in the future. So I really think this is a kind of an amazing example, a Fabian example of kind of local communities, individuals kind of getting together and actually making a change, and you can actually measure that. There are metrics around a catchment. You can actually see the difference in a catchment. You can see the difference that you can make in a catchment. I think the potential is a really empowering moment.
I do too, and I'm grinning like crazy. I mean, I'm aware of it. First of all, the thing I want to just respond back, and I'll be very quick, dear Mr. Chairperson. But down south, catchments are rural.
Yes.
And I think of my time on Otago Regional Council and bloody catchments. It's a different matter altogether. But in the cities, I don't think people. I think where there's been flood, they have begun to understand what catchments are. In Wellington, I think we're going to have to learn maybe the hard way. Do you see what I mean? And Christchurch, wherever you are, lovely person in Christchurch, it's the same sort of thing. But I think that you've given me real hope, actually. And the other thing is, sometimes we can get really sad and say we have to buy out the land, what do we call it, and shift the people away from it. We may have to manage retreat. We may have to do that, but we may also have some chances to do some clever catchment things that mitigate there. Thank you very much.
There's one of the key things that happened before the Te Aonga project was that we did an upper catchment plan for Te Aonga Oakley Creek, and we did it with 6 mana whenua partners. It was one of the first times that local government in our area had worked with mana whenua. And that put us in the right place when the project came up to say, actually, this aligns with the kaupapa of the catchment plan, and we have these things in place. I had something else, but I've forgotten now. Sorry.
Thank you so much.
Marianne, one of the interesting comments I've heard in Auckland is a little neighbourhood group which started off simply by going about the exercise of saying, well, what is the map of our catchment? We're a cul-de-sac, we're a bunch of houses. And when you look at Matthew's maps now, and you look at those maps show incredible intimacy about how creeks actually went up little valleys and the tributaries to the creeks. And if you map those specific little catchments, that's one thing. That's a galvanizing thing that can empower people. But I think on top of that, then you can ask the question. So, and Matthew hinted at this, and so did Julie. What was the Maori habitation of that place? What were they doing? What was the habitats that they created? Where were their food sources? Where was their recreation? And as a result of that, people can start reconceptualizing a naturalistic approach to what their neighborhood could in fact look like. It doesn't stop there being a high-rise building with space in between, but it does mean that you're now taking control of what you actually have in your neighborhood that you can invest in.
Yeah, I mean, a really good example of that is in the Freeman's Bay, which Freeman which flooded. You know, the original the place name was Tuna Mao. You know, where we catch eels. So that's a little bit of a clue that there was a kind of a stream there, and
it was a good spot.
It was a good spot, you know, and which we stuck in a pipe, and then it flooded. You know.
Now, Adrian, are you able to ask a question? Your hand's up, I can see, but you're still on mute. Maybe you're having a cup of tea. Jeff, you can take yourself off mute, I'm sure.
Yes.
Far away.
Yeah, it's great listening to the community response. I'm aware of a time where our Ministry of Works used to have a division for looking at national flooding and flood management.
Yeah.
And they had a tremendous amount of information. Is there anything in place for it now?
Yeah.
For that information and that planning?
Yeah, there's a big Endeavour project which is being run by NIWA and by the amazing Emily Lane. I'm sure we're all online, but it's a 5-year project to kind of map New Zealand Aotearoa and look at the flooding. That's a really amazing. I'm pretty sure they give kind of bulletins about how they're going. I think they're about halfway through the project. But yeah, there's definitely really high-powered research being done in that area.
There's also, from the Auckland Council perspective, you know, as Matthew's pointed out, we have a lot of this information in GIS already, but there's also work being done systematically around coastal resilience, some of which is looking at managed retreat, and they just did a pilot, which was recently reported back around some areas in beachlands. And so they're looking to scale that up. How we do that with less money, I'm not quite sure, but that's a whole other Fabian's topic. But there's also work underway to review what happened around the floods versus what the modelling and the plans showed us would happen as well. So it's getting quite a lot of attention within Auckland Council at the moment, and I suspect that next year, not this year because we don't have time, but next year I imagine that there will be a bid for a targeted rate in the long-term plan budget discussions, specifically around stormwater planning and implementation, but we'll have to wait and see. But certainly we've underinvested for many years in planning, in maintenance, and in building the infrastructure and the many different types of infrastructure. So yeah, I know there's a number of people quite keen to seize the opportunity to turn that around. Yeah.
No, sorry, Jeff, you got another follow-up question?
It says it's the same follow-up.
Yeah, you just go.
Take Tikawiti, for example. In the 1958 flood of Tikawiti, my father was surveyed the whole catchment area for it, and then they widened the river and everything. Recently, these new storms, Tikawiti very nearly flooded seriously again. Who's planning for that? Is it up to the councils, or will it be part of Three Waters?
This is probably more in my space, but I don't actually know the answer, except that the part of Three Waters that is sort of the least certain, from what I can tell so far, is the stormwater aspect of it. There's not a lot of certainty there about what's going to happen with the assets and stuff. So I would say probably people haven't really thought that through yet. In the first instance, it should be the council's responsibility to at least do the planning and appropriate land use, the zoning, the flood overlays and limits on development. And certainly that's what Auckland Council has been doing through the Plan Change 78. And one of the important parts of Plan Change 78 is identifying flooding as a qualifying matter, which then you can make sure that development in areas that are covered by that qualifying matter is appropriate to address the qualifying matter, if that makes sense. So yeah, so that's coming.
Can I throw something in there too? In those areas where you have both a regional council and then the city and district councils, it's very much regional council's job, responsibility. to be looking at floods. And if I think in Otago and I think of South Dunedin, yes, there were all the things about the drains and the stormwater and all those things that were run by the City Council. But the future is very much in the hands of the Regional Council. That, of course, may change when the second bill that comes in after the RMA, called the whatever it is it Planning Bill, Rafe? I can't remember its blessed name. That bill in which those
Spatial Planning Act.
Yeah, that's going to be planned by regional councils working with other councils in a province or an area in several giant catchments to work our way through. If people think Three Waters is a problem, can I just get them to read the second bill coming through under the RMA, because that is really good and intelligent planning, but boy, is it going to piss people off, especially with a smile. Retired.
Okay, Adrian, you've dropped out of questioning now.
I've done a chat.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
I've
Well,
asked the question in chat.
thank you, Adrian. We'll come back to that then. Robert, you've got a question. Thanks,
Yes.
Jeff.
I've heard the comment, particularly in Auckland, that the financial incentives for building new houses is to build large houses. This goes back to Julie's map of the middle type of housing, the apartments, the middle type, and then the traditional type of housing. Is it your impression that the financial incentives to build bigger houses all the time, is that a major problem? And how, if it is, what can you do about it?
Me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, sure. So I think some of the changes are intended to make it to give incentives to build a wider range of typologies. The issue is that, you know, we rely on the market, right? And as we know from the housing crisis that we've been living in for a number of years. In fact, I have a cartoon from the 90s that I sometimes use in housing talks that talks about the housing crisis. You know, the market does not always provide. And that's where, you know, regulation plays a role, the state, local government plays a role for sure. And we also have kāinga ora now in this space, and a lot of the development that they are doing is in that missing middle area because the market hasn't been building those houses. So although the rules are changing so that it will be make more economical sense and stuff to build a range of houses, we have the housing stock we have, and it's going to take you know, probably a generation to you know, to deal with existing housing stock and you know, recreating the gaps that we have, unless there's more intervention and unless kāinga ora or some willing developers are you know, quite deliberately driving that stuff. It's quite tricky because a lot of the places where developers want to do those kinds of developments, we wouldn't necessarily want them to do them because the land is cheap on the edge of the city, but we don't want to build the infrastructure out there, and from a climate point of view it's a terrible idea, as well as building on productive soils. So you know, it's so take for example the developments down in Drury, the one that they want to do out at Winton. You know, the housing typologies may be great, but you are not going to have enough jobs for everybody there. You are going to have a lot of people who are going to have to leave the community to access services, to access education. And so you might have a really good housing mix, but actually we need the housing mix on the city fringe. That's where we need it, and we don't have it, and it's going to take years to get that sorted. Sorry, that's a bit of a gloomy answer.
Yeah, I mean, it's housing's not really my thing, but I mean, I think in Auckland there has been a number of developers who are building apartments, that kind of middle kind of apartment, maybe 4 or 5 stories. So Ockham are doing quite a few of that quite a few of those sorts of apartments. Interestingly, they're not apartments for sale, they're apartments for rent. So that's sort of maybe tells you a little bit about the Auckland kind of market and what people can afford and what they, what they obviously can't afford. But as Julie said, there is definitely a lot of housing, big houses being built in the periphery. We go up north quite a lot, and just every time we drove through the outskirts of Orewa, these enormous houses being built, and single story, single on single lots, occupying pretty much all the whole site. So yeah, it's Auckland housing is it's a complex beast.
And it's worth noting too that I think some of it is about people providing within their house for aspects of their lives that they might otherwise get collectively. So I mean, for example, you feel like you have to have a room for your gym equipment, or actually you could join a gym. Yeah. You feel like you have to have an office space because you're now having to work from home because you no longer, you're encouraged to do that and stuff like. So there's stuff there, and then that in turn actually isolates people from each other because you're not going to those bumping spaces, So, we do actually, there has to be a bit of a rethink. I think I'm really excited about co-housing spaces, and ironically we have a lot of co-housing spaces. They're called retirement villages, but if you're under 65 and you want to live somewhere like that, very difficult. And so the idea that you have your own space, you have your own apartment, you might have a little kitchen and stuff, but if you wanted to, for example, have a dinner party, there's a space with a bigger kitchen that you could book. There's a lounge and you can go and hang out with other people, but you also have your own social space, and those will have smaller footprints and work really well with the idea of going up rather than out too, communal gardens, all of that kind of stuff. So it's, the atomization of our lives, of sharing less and everybody having to own their own whatever. We need to move away from that, not just because of how resource hungry it is, but also because it's hopelessly inefficient in terms of climate, from my point of view. So, it's a conversation about, do you actually need 6 bedrooms? My mum lived in a 3-bedroom house on a near quarter-acre section with only her and one other person living in it for over 20 years after I left home. She didn't really need to, but she felt she did, and that was real. I'm not saying we deny that, but how can we and if we had more of that middle type of housing, she probably would have been comfortable to move much earlier than she did when she moved straight into a retirement village.
Julie, I'm amazed at the number of people who can buy a cup of coffee in a cafe, open their laptop and still be there for 3 hours later, working from home, as it were, and all they've paid for rent is the price of a cup of coffee. I see there's several people in the chat: Ralph, Timo, Adrian, Brent. If any of you would like to elaborate on the questions you've made in the chat, please feel free to do that. Brent, Ralph, you might be one.
Thanks for the opportunity, Phil. Yeah, it's been a great discussion. I found one of the most interesting inputs to the chat on the margin was from Tino Neubar, is it? Who was making the point, and he could probably make it more eloquently than I can, that a lot of the institutional constraints arise through the legislation and the regulation of the housing market and the land market. So that definitely needs some attention, partly the problems with the Resource Management Act, the RMA, which have been holding us back in some respects for some time, because that's been very sort of reluctant, being a permissive bit of legislation. It was very reluctant to think about what were the big goals that we wanted to shoot for. So, for example, did we care about intensification as a goal? Well, you weren't allowed to care under the RMA until the National Policy Statement on Urban Development came along. So it was very much left to the market. So that was a permissive model from the 80s and 90s. And that has obviously been demonstrated to have real problems with it. And let's hope that changes to the RMA, or the replacement of the RMA with the new Natural and Built Environment Bill and the Spatial Planning Bill makes a real difference if it comes through. But there are many other aspects in which the legislation and the regulation around these areas has constrained us in the past. So I think the lesson from that is that we. Oh, is it? Well, what could you? No, I'll continue anyhow. I think the lesson is that we need to think seriously about where the limits of the market have been and are at the moment, and not to be afraid about intervening for better social and ecological outcomes.
Mhm.
Can I maybe just comment on that? I hope that that's one of the real opportunities that comes out of these floods and natural disasters. And we do need to take silver linings from them, that people see that actually what worked just to stop a bad result in a locality, but also to rescue people who needed it in the emergency, but also in the recovery, was people working together. And that actually the market didn't swoop in and rescue anybody. It wasn't it wasn't big banks spending their profits on rescue helicopters. It was the things that we do together. It was the things that we put money in for together, and neighbours helping neighbours and all of that stuff. It wasn't big business that came to the rescue, and some of them have made some good donations since, and that's great, but actually they're able to make those big donations because frankly they're not making a big enough contribution to the pool that we resource together through rates and through tax.
I absolutely agree with that. In fact, there's another example of that, which is that at the insurance industry, which purportedly appears to cover us for these sort of events, is really not been performing that well. And you can see that in the slow payouts or slow assessments of people's damage, and people having to wait a year or 6 months or 18 months for payouts and assessments of their housing, and that's a real failure of the insurance market there.
So just a sort of quick comment. I mean, maybe one way we could perhaps harness the market, or the capitalist beast, is maybe thinking about different housing models. So if you could say to developers, you can build higher, but the quid pro quo is you have to have a small footprint. You have to actually have more permeable space. That overland flow path that's running through your piece of land, you actually have to kind of you actually can't build on that, but you can build on this corner, and you can build. And this is going to be an anathema to many people, but maybe you can build 6 stories or 7 stories or 8 stories or kind of higher. So they're getting it's called FAR. This kind of equation, FAR, floor area ratio. So that potentially they're getting their return, but actually they are providing a kind of a less destructive way of building in a catchment. That could be one kind of approach.
In a funny kind of way, didn't we used to do that when we said, and I may be wrong here, when we said, yes, you can subdivide and build all these houses. I'm not saying that was done well, but in return, you have to leave some of your land for a playground or a park.
A reserve contribution.
So that way of working has already been there. I just want to tell you something lovely that's come out of the things, and it's come out of the East Coast and out of Napier and the rural areas. There are 25 marae up there, all affected. And this is a lovely story, and it's of Wellington actually doing well. Wellington academics and public servants. On marae, you've often seen on the walls all the photos. Well, when the mud came in, it affected the photos, and that really hurts. And our people went up there from Te Papa and from Heritage, and they said, yes, you can put them in water, and then put them in a freezer. We then went out and bought every bloody freezer left available in Gisborne and Napier and gave them up to marae. And I think it's a lovely story. It's a lovely story of know-how, specialist know-how, actually working effectively at local level. So there are no freezers up there now.
It's a lovely
Tino-
story. And I would just say that we in Auckland anyway, and I mentioned this before, the idea that often the reserve contribution was the least economic piece of land, and obviously we need to turn that around.
Yep.
And we have all sorts of strange pieces of land in my area, because this area was predominantly developed by Universal Homes and Keith Hay Homes in the 50s and 60s, and they also controlled the council at the time. So yeah, I won't say anything more about that. But the other thing is that in the city centre, it was quite common to give people bonus floors. So you could build higher in return for having some public access space within the building. So the idea of having a plaza that people could walk through to get from, you know, Queen Street to Albert Street, that kind of thing. But interestingly, the Waitemata Local Board did a map of some of those areas some years back, and discovered that a whole lot of them were actually inaccessible to the public. So, you know, there's a coming up with the idea and putting it in place, but then there's an enforcement aspect to
Absolutely.
it that is a really important part of that piece, because it's all very well to say you can go higher if there's a public balcony, but then to have no access to that public balcony but still build 2 floors higher is, you know, that's the market at its worst.
Yeah, they actually do this in Vancouver. They actually say that, you know, there's actually a deliberate policy. You can actually build as high as you like, you know, but these are the things this is the quid pro quo. And so, you know, building an art gallery will,
Yeah,
there is quite a big social kind of payoff. But so I'll just tell one story. I do a tour with my students of Central Auckland, and we always go to an unnamed building which got a height thing because they made the public floor, they made the ground floor public. I always take my students in there, and we always get hassled by the guards. It's like a little teaching moment of, you know, what's public and what's private. Once we actually went through the thing, the guard followed us. We went into the garden, and he locked the door behind us, so we couldn't get back into the building.
wow.
So,
Well, you just riff-raff for Matthew.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's obviously, yeah.
Can I
The other
just-
thing with Vancouver that just really quickly, Phil, is that in a lot of cases, they actually demand that the public amenity be built before the
Yeah.
commercial
Oh, yeah, good
residential
point.
property.
They're much
And
more.
that
Good point.
gets a lot more community buy-in, as well as making sure that that part is delivered, as
Yeah.
opposed to they get partway through and they go bust or whatever. And yeah.
People, I am looking to close this off at 8:30. I just wondered if Adrian or Tino wanted to talk, and maybe Brent from the comments on the chat.
It's Adrian here. Kia ora, everyone.
Yes, go ahead, Adrian.
I was doing my submission to the council, the Auckland Council's budget today, and I noted that they are going to make consideration of a 1.4 or 1.2 billion, 1.5 billion of new using debt as a measure of responding to the recent storm damage. And I will tell you that I live at the top of Coburn, and was told by whānau in Melbourne that there was a flood at the bottom of our street. So I was only 200 metres away from the flooding in Dryden Street, but couldn't see it at the top of the street. So is there a view from either you, Julie, or the other speaker tonight about whether, apologies, about whether that new debt from Auckland Council taking it on is likely to be adequate? And I fully accept that you may have to temper your views or opinions on the matter if you're a councillor. Julie.
Sure. I did write a comment in response, but just to, I guess, very briefly say, yeah, I do have to be a little bit careful at the moment. I have to maintain an open mind. However, that is different from an empty mind, as I frequently remind my colleagues. And I just do not know if that's going to be enough at this point. We have a lot of analysis to do. and a lot of maths to do. But also there's going to be quite a complicated interplay in terms of liability. So council self-insures in part. And so we have had a conversation about whether our self-insurance fund is big enough or not, and whether to make that larger. That was in confidential, so I can't really talk about that. But there's the interaction there with insurers. There's the interaction there with private landowners, EQC, central government. The Ministry of Education is a huge landholder through the Auckland area as well, and Kāinga Ora. So there's a lot of stuff at play. And, you know, there's complicated ones, like there's a landslide in a park not far from my house, which you can't see from the road and you wouldn't know is there at all. But actually, I think they've ended up red stickering one of the houses that's underneath the slip, and they certainly yellow stickered a number of other ones. And so they're showing me their section, and they've actually lost parts of their land into the park. So, you know, what's the answer to that? Do we go, okay, well, that's where the land wants to be, or do we in some way remediate that? Do we do halfway, where we do a retaining wall so it doesn't get any worse? Like, what is the answer there, and who pays for it? It's really hard. And these people have owned the land since the 70s and planted lots of trees on it and done the right things, and devastated to see some of it go down the hill, but at the same time accept that they're next to a park, and actually maybe that's the best place for that land to be now. So it's complicated, and there's not, what's in the budget. This budget is the most up in the air budget I've seen in 12 years. And so to that end, you've got till 11 p.m. tonight, folks, to send on a submission if you haven't already, and know that it will have more influence than, people's minds are around the table are really not made up. People know that, and sorry, Phil, and I'm going off topic here, but people, I don't think any of the major components that are in the proposal have the numbers to pass unaltered. And certainly not the budget as a whole. There's a proposal in there to put, and this is where I come back on topic, Phil. There's a proposal in there to put 1% rates increase that will go directly into the storm work, but we don't know what that is yet.
Can I just say, I think I'll bring it to a close. I am so impressed. I really do love the power of maps. And I thought the content of maps in the presentations was extraordinary, especially the two references to the significance of Maori history and Maori knowledge about how they lived on the isthmus for so long without having the calamities. But I also wish to just thank Matthew and Julie for the immense amount of work and the incredible amount of knowledge you've brought to this discussion tonight. It's been really good. I know there are several people in the room who've also got a truckload of knowledge from different perspectives and from their different backgrounds. And some of that came through in the chat and in the questions. And I just want to appreciate the value of that. It is my intention to have another speaker on climate and climate change and its impact on the wider New Zealand society. A lecturer from Victoria University, speaking at the end of April. So I'll send that out when it's finalised, and we'll all get to know what that session will be about. Can I also just thank you all for attending to a Fabian event. The Fabians are an organisation which doesn't have a membership per se. It just has a big mailing list, and then it has a donation site on their website. And if you want to contribute to offset the costs of what Fabians do, all we ask is that you just periodically go onto the website, click on the donations column, think of a number and double it and give it to us. That would be great. So thank you again to Matthew and Julie. It was very impressive, the amount of work you put in and the quality of those PowerPoints. We will try and get those PowerPoints up onto the website, as we will try and get a recording of this session. So thank you so much, and I wish you all a very good night.